Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's June 16, 2025, and today we're speaking with Stefan Huard, researcher at the French Institute of Research for Development, IRD. We're talking about his recently published book in the Asian Anthropology's Bergen Books series. It's called Calibrated Engagement: Chronicles of Local Politics in the Heartland of Myanmar, and it's currently available for open access online. It's a really valuable study of a dry zone village during what we now know was an incredibly unique moment in time in Myanmar. Hello, Stefan.
Hi. Hey, how are you?
Congratulations on your book. So it was based on your PhD, as I said, and we actually talked on this program nearly 8 years ago, after you'd finished most of your fieldwork and you'd done some writing about it, but before you'd really started turning it into this book. So I want to start by asking you about that journey, because, since then we've had a pandemic, we've had a coup, we've had an earthquake. So what have you been doing for the last 8 years or 7 years before this book came out? How did you get it out?
Yes, thanks for having me, Luke. Quite a lot of things have been happening since the last time I was on this podcast. I was back from fieldwork at the time, trying to get my ideas clear about what I just experienced during the fieldwork. And so I was starting to write a lot about the data. And later on that year, and even later also did some more archive work and lots of reading also back and forth to sort of put together all of my ideas and the material, because I wanted to dive deeper in history than the ethnographic data would allow me, especially during the early colonial period that I could access in London archives. So I've been doing lots of work on that. Finished the PhD and defended it around 2019. I think it was December 2019, and then went straight away back in Myanmar, working for the great NGO, and I've been managing a research program on land issues. And then COVID happened and the coup happened, and then back into France several months after the coup. And in that process, I started to transform the PhD into a book. So the good thing was that I already, writing the PhD, I had the idea of turning it into a book, but still it was quite a lot of work to do. And back in France, then in 2022, I got a research and teaching position in Paris at the Heartland School for Social Sciences. And this gave me the opportunity also to really work on the book and turn it into this my first book, Calibrated Engagement, that I'm really happy about.
Yeah, well done. I mean, lots of challenges for everybody, but also for birthing something like this, and you've overcome all of them. So you've mentioned the title of the book again, and that's a great place to start. There are two words in particular that I think stand out in the title. The first one is calibrated engagement. I think most people, they go, "Oh yeah, I know what engagement means, and I know what calibrated means, but calibrated engagement, what's that about?" And then the second one is chronicles. So why did you use these terms for your title, and what do they refer to?
Thanks. So there was quite a lot to unpack here, so I'll try to keep it as simple as and quick as possible. But I first came around the word engagement because I found it very interesting to find about the people agency and the dependency relationship that are existing in the trials where I've been doing some field work. So I didn't want to think about people being just dependent within hierarchical relationship that they cannot really escape, because I saw how people negotiated their position and the way they do politics and the day-to-day life. But then it's about turning the word engagement away from the usual meaning about humanitarian engagement, for instance, and just use it as a device. You get inside, you can craft a relationship, you can enter different relationship with various kind of entities. And this work of evaluation, this work of coaching relationship, potentialities, and how you can be entrapped also in different relationships. This is what the calibration is at play, how people calibrate the way they engage in the world with various kind of entities. And that kind of described the process of doing politics in the day-to-day life. So that's the idea that kind of crystallized what I tried to do in this book, and I'm really happy to have found that title that summarizes it. Then about the chronicles of local politics. The chronicles it's a sort of it's a way of giving history its due and of not thinking of history as something that is just past, and also like the different readings of that people might have on about politics. So obviously there is a lot of flows into working in such a long period of time, from early colonial period down to today. So Chronicles is also a way of trying to explain the different snapshots of the different parts of history that are brought into the people's present, and the continuities and change that we can witness in the daily life and in the politics of villages in the dry home.
Thank you. That's great. That explains it really well. And you've brought up the history there, and I have to say that especially at the beginning of your book, the historical stuff is so rich and so wonderful, and really anchors your ethnography in a village, in the dry zone near the town of Molnyo, which is unique in itself. But it really having that historical background is even more valuable. And I also, though, all nonfiction books, I mean, they immediately become texts of history, right? Once they're published. I mentioned earlier the unique moment that your fieldwork was performed in, and the context that you're writing about. But maybe we should make it a bit clearer for listeners. So I wanted to ask you, so how much has the world that you wrote about, that you write about in this book, changed by the coup? This huge rupture in 2021, because you're writing about politics, and this coup has led to incredible political change in that area. So now, when you're talking to people, how do you describe this moment that you could hang out in this village with these local politicians and local people and learn about how things worked?
That's a great question, because when I was starting doing fieldwork, I gathered from my elders, my colleagues who've been working in Myanmar for a long time, that this was quite unique, and I didn't really realize it at the time. For me, it was like trying to do local ethnography, day-to-day life in a place that wasn't really interested for a lot of people also at that time. So towards my colleagues, it was more like some kind of question about why it has been so difficult to do it. And they took a long time to realize. And obviously the coup also bring me a lot of food for thought about what is this landscape and how the military state is transforming it or influencing it. Then also about the local people, they were also kind of obviously very welcoming in many kind of situation, but they were also telling me like, why are you not scared of being around? And I was, I don't know, perhaps stupid that I wasn't that scared at that time. And I feel always often very secure, but I understand better also the why they were a bit scared for me, and knowing the different tension that's been running out in the countryside, and the question of trust, and the question of delation, and all of those things kind of were brought back with the 221 coup, and made me realize like this density of the atmosphere of the threat, and the issue of trust is mostly something that is kind of coming to the forefront now, and I understand better the peculiarity of my fieldwork around that time. It was kind of easier than obviously to navigate around the different places.
Yeah. And you've incorporated a little, like a few pages, a concluding section in your book where you talk about what's happened. But fundamentally, you don't inflect all of your findings with a post-coup kind of lens. You keep it to stand on its own. I guess we'll talk about some of the debates that you're sort of intervening in when you wrote this book. With this data, wider debates in Southeast Asian studies and anthropology. One of those is that you try to problematize the approach to analyze politics in Southeast Asia through the binary of upland and lowland. So this is a really long-standing and still very popular way of thinking about the region. So what do you think is the problem with that approach? Has its time passed, or is it just not useful for what you're trying to find out?
I still think it's useful. It's useful because it's been framing the debate. So we have to understand like how this has been framed. And I don't want to just come up and say, oh, we should think of it completely differently. I think there are a lot of things to take from this kind of framing, but mostly because I've been doing fieldwork and working in place that was the lowland, the old Burmese Pama culture. Basically, it was the typical lowland area, which has been characterized as a state space. And obviously, working with this kind of binary, there is always simplifications. And I came up with this, confronting this framework. I was thinking that this is not a state space at all. I mean, we have to think about what will be a state space, because a lot of the work has been based on the idea of the upland mostly, and thinking that the lowland will be just kingdom areas. Whereas the work of creating the state is something that is interesting to look at, and then talking the local population, not as completely affiliated with the state or the king or the kingdom that is there, is very important. And I think this also came up quite strongly with the coup. We forgot that the Trison wasn't a space that was completely affiliated with the military. We knew it because of the elections. We knew it because of the different revolts that happened in the past, the Depayin, the 88 period, and so on and so forth, but not at that scale. So that's why the historical outlook through moments of violence, for instance, tell us a lot more than just thinking with this binary of lowland and upland. But I think it's an interesting hook also for people to, okay, look at this book. It's about the lowland, and it's not the lowland as a state space. And there is a lot of processes that are very we can really compare with the political dynamics in the upland. I take one example, the catching in the book, but that's just one. I think it's good to work against this binary, but use it as a hook because it still makes sense in the mind of a lot of people. So let's walk through this hook and deconstruct it.
Yep, that makes sense. And we haven't mentioned exactly where you lived and where you're writing about yet. So we should do that. So we're talking about a village called Gorgie, which is just northeast of Myanmar, which is a pretty reasonably sized town. You know, it's been in the news quite a lot since 2021. And that's the village that you use to sort of generalize a bit about what you call Anya, right? Which is this central area. Maybe I want to ask you just about Gorgie and, you know, how you found yourself there, but also about Anya. Like, why do you choose to use that term? Because obviously we could use lots of different terms. The dry zone, which I always say just by habit, the Burma Heartland. Of course, you've got Heartland in your title, the Heartland of Myanmar. So that's maybe just a synonym for you for Anya. But then we could also say Sagain region, right? You know, so why did you choose to write about Anya, and what is Gorgie to you?
The word Anya, I started to use more and more after the coup, actually. I wasn't using it that much before. So I think it's also some kind of unconscious way work that is happening, because it started to gain some kind of, regain some kind of consistency as a space, but kind of cultural space, but very fragmented. So I use it in the book, but I still think there is quite a lot of work to be done about this idea of Anya. And now we have discussions about it after the coup, especially because the Heartland, the issue of political representation that is emerging since the coup, and the various form of localism, the idea of fragmentation, the different forces at play. So I use it as a way of making this, perhaps showing the kind of some sort of homogeneity that exists in this place. But we should be careful not to overstate it, obviously. So it was also a way of qualifying this heartland in a different way, because when we talk about lowland, I mean, for instance, in Myanmar, the delta is also a bit different and the dry zone. And we also need to be cautious about the different narratives that make it as a specific space of uniform culture. Because we are, for instance, when I was living in Goji, I was becoming a Nyata, son of Anya, with all the attributes and characteristics that should be attributed to me. So yeah, I use Anya. I used different Lower Chindrin district for the colonial period, the Sakine region, sub-Sakine region, and dry zone, Heartland. I think it's good to have a lot of terms so we can walk through the ambiguities and the tension. Then about Koji, it became a place where it's a place where I was adopted by a family, especially by one of my brother from Goji, who was headman for not that long period of time, and welcomed me in his family, and I was able to live there. So it's a place where I get bored quite a lot, where I did a lot of things, like day-to-day life. It's a space that is very much familiar to me, where I spend very important time also in my life, and where I'm accepted as a person, and where I cannot go back these days, obviously. So in terms of fieldwork, it's a lot about it. It made me think a lot about what is ethnography in a place where people adopt you, and how you write about them, with them, understanding the different dilemmas, making interviews, not making interviews. The posture of doing research is very different from many other kind of research that are a bit more detached from the fieldwork. So it's also about my own way of engaging, of crafting my position, of accepting and refusing the position that was attributed to me. That in some ways I was also calibrating my engagement with the people over there. So there is some kind of continuity into that. That's why it's also my book is just a reading of local politics. I don't want to claim that it is exactly what is true for everyone, but I think it's powerful to see people agency, especially in the current situation and the engagement in the resistance over there.
Yeah, and you are very precise in your language in this book, I think. You adopt different tenses and different styles at different times, and you say, why. So when you refer to it as a reading, everything like that. And I really appreciated that. I like that kind of, sensitivity and versatility to sort of change. I could go in two directions here. I kind of want to ask more about Gorgie, but then you brought up agency, so I think I could go in that direction. But maybe let's just get a bit more about Gorgie itself. You write quite a bit about it and its sort of rivalry with some other villages that are nearby. Gorgie sort of exists in relation to this big town nearby, Molnua, but also these other villages. Gorgie sort of exists in tension with Myanmar proper, as you refer to it. And so this seems to be quite important, this relationship for you, thinking about place in particular. And I just wanted to ask you about that. You even say that a direct quote is that these two areas, these two villages, communities are not in solidarity, yet they're neighbors. So could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, a big part of the book is about the transformation of the local political landscape and within which Koji, the village, is. So the idea was not to think just about the village in just a cohesive space that is closed from the outside. And I could have done more into looking at the various forces that cross the villages, but one of the very important things was the grouping of the villages together as a village tract. And that's how Goji became attached with Mimelan village, which became the name of a village tract around after the pacification campaign, the countryside around the early 20th century. And the tension between the two villages was very alive when I was living there. Basically, football matches, pagoda festival, and so on were very strong moment of tension. Also elections, obviously, because they got to elect the headman twice when I was there, 2013 and 16. So I was interested into, okay, what can we learn from this tension and in this rivalry? Because they are not very big villages, and Goji is, if we take the population together, it's a bit less than 500 people. a bit more for Mimilong. And it was very interesting to look at because the question of headship of village headmen were creating by the British at that time was very much at play also there about who controls what and how people define the way they are legitimate to live in that landscape. So Mimilong, they have also narratives of foundation connected with the Nat spirit that is alone not too far from Moiwa, and they kind of derived their history from being that the descendant of this the retainers, the warriors that would be accompanying this ruler before he killed himself in the Children River. And Goji people were referring to the landscape, but the sacred place in the landscape in a very different way. So the narrative of foundation will be different. The relationship between the villages will be obviously the neighbors, as you say. So they also intermarry with each other, but they always have this conversation that they don't like each other, which is very true for many places on Earth between villages. But what can we learn from this? And as I was saying, elections were also important, and who embody the institution of villagemanship is very important. Who is the villageman, and who was it before, and how having the villageman from my village is important, and what does the work of villageman is, especially when you embody this institution, and how you deal with past memories of violence or dispossession, of corruption, and these kind of things. Because you have this kind of morality and the narrative about Mimilong is not the best place for morality, as seen from Goji, and the reverse is also true. So that's why I was kind of interested about this divide in this area.
It's also just fascinating to have this kind of history and context at a time when the dry zone is kind of being cleaved into little fiefdoms, with people with different political beliefs, and now they're in conflict with each other. And you kind of sketch out, two communities that are very close to each other, but have quite different histories. And you can imagine, that things could go very different ways for them. And so it kind of is an interesting thought experiment for different parts of the dry zone and the choices that people are making at the moment in a very fraught political kind of moment. I remember at one point you talk about that in a previous pre-colonial context, that the two areas may have sort of paid duties to different leaders at particular times. So they may have actually not been a part of the same cohesive political structure. Is that right?
Yeah, but I mean, it's working through a lot of different hypotheses. But yeah, before, even after it was a village tract, the political affiliation could have been were different than the one we saw today. So the work of colonialism and the work of the socialist state and post-socialist state also, how it impacted the local hierarchies. So there have been some affiliation between villages that were not very close by. And so, for instance, in this case, Mimilong was much closer to Tazi, which was a place with you have like a ruling elite that could extend up to that area. There was also Choka, not too far. There was also Yuadong. So it's more of the kind of local microcosm of satellite. Let's use the mandala metaphor if we want to, but this kind of landscape. And so looking through what people owe to whom, and how the various family Myoyo, the family segment, stays or moved in one place or another. So it was interesting to look at jurisdiction, state jurisdiction as such, village tract, and different forces inside it. Because there was the narrative about colonialism as being changing everything. It been changing a lot, especially as being removing the traditional authorities. And the village men emerged, and it was, the whole more economy also of James Scott was built also upon that, and the work of Stanley also reinforced that narrative. So for me, I was more interested into looking at both, like how colonialism transform things or not, looking into land issues quite a lot through courts and property, but also the form of indebtedness and political affiliation that remain, and that was known also up to until today. So this was a difficult work to do, but I tried to sketch out, because fragmentation, competition for affiliation, and so on are processes that are at play through the colonial period and even after. But one dynamic that I found also very interesting later on was more of the insulation or islanding of villages in terms of political entities through the work of after the socialist periods. But we can talk more on that if you want later.
All right, thank you. I think that's a good overview of Gorgie. There are some other surprising things people might find, like, for example, that you write that in Gorgie the rural population is no longer mostly farmers, because Myanmar as a whole, the dry zone as a whole, is still majority agricultural. But Gorgie was maybe at the forefront of change because it was in a sort of peri-urban area. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It was like still half of the population were Tantu, or see themselves as real farmers. But a lot of people were going as, men were going as carpenters in Moiwa. People with savings will put their child through university as much as they could for working different companies, fertilizer, mining company. all of these things. And so I don't know if it was at the forefront of change, but it was quite clear that the since 2000, the year 2000, things have been moving quite fast in the economical sector. And the hierarchy that was quite strong, especially in times of hardship between Tantu and Nyotu, or Ledema, basically the farmer, the real farmer, those who have the means and know how to farm, and the people were more like laborer. This kind of division that was created in the, let's say, 60s, 70s, 90s, away from the previous political affiliation, was kind of also shifting away, because accessing was difficult, and because you had more opportunities in the cities, and the migration, and the connection with the different mines, and the work that was going on in Mandalay. The business of making waving laundry and so on for a lot of women networks connected with India, and so on and so forth. So there was lots of different forces at play. It was difficult to balance the study between, looking at full extent in the present and the different networks, which I didn't completely do, and looking at the place. And I decided to look at the place also because moving a lot in those areas was not always easy, because of surveillance. It depends where, but you need to work through trusted relationship. And yeah, so I decided to work in that small village.
Which allowed you to get so much rich detail. So now you've brought up, agency, and you've explained a little bit about what calibrated engagement means. So it's clear that I think that you're writing against structuralist analyses of societies, and you're talking about how politics in Gorgie is about how people calibrate their engagements. I wonder, did you begin your fieldwork like already skeptical about hierarchy or clientelism and systems as the main way to explain social life? Or did this question of structure versus agency, was it something you had to wrestle with before you made up your mind, or was it clear from the data? Because I think that big question, structure and agency, is sort of partly ideological or philosophical in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of try to come to terms with both. When I first was doing fieldwork, it was clear that I was more on the side of agency, so to speak, because I believe that people are not puppets. And looking through explaining rituals, for instance, as the enactment of the same all the time, didn't have that much value. And after writing the book, through the process of writing the book, this also came, to come to terms with those, especially an issue of how people enact history and so on. But I was much more into looking at, what people are actually doing. So, for instance, I was not too much into looking at religious facts, for instance. That was something that I would stay away a bit And that was not what we should do as an ethnographer. We should be interested in everything, but I wasn't that much interested into it, and I had to come to terms again through that and change my mind. Um, but still, I would say that overall, I'm more on the side of agency. But I still believe that hierarchy and patron-client patronage relationship are useful idioms to think about long-term things. I'm just not very, just don't agree with the idea that people are just dependent and can do nothing. I don't see it. And when we look at actual situations, this is not what it is. I mean, this is not what is happening. I took some examples. So the methodological way of looking at it was working through the transfer, what circulates between people, and when they exchange things, what is happening. So the moral economy of marriage and so on, as described by Schober and after Lehman and so on, like how people are making themselves above others through their charisma, Mary, Kuto, and so on. This was also very important for me to look at because I've been in many situations where those things were not clear cut at all. It was never really clear cut. Sometimes it is, but I mean, there are scenes, so it's about looking at interaction, the world not completely as a theater, but, like Kaufman work and so on. So looking at what's really happening and circulating between people is how you could look at embarrassment, for instance, and reputation of people, and how this kind of moral worlds also are part of this political landscape.
It's been a long time since I read it, but you engage with it a little bit in the book. Ward Keeler's, work on hierarchy. It seems like he sort of, goes very hard on that as a system for explaining things, but he leaves little loopholes for sort of agency in there. And it seems like you sort of are going very hard on agency, but you're sort of leaving loopholes for how, hierarchy is important as a way of, I don't know, explaining some of these relations.
I am, but that's something that is always in my mind. It's basically hierarchy and equality, how they're connecting each other in the context. So I was not too much into the hierarchy at the beginning. I also had long discussion with my friend and colleague Maxime Boudry about this Chizushin arrangement. And regarding the work of Ward Keeler, navigating and traffic in hierarchy, for me, if the hierarchy is the main system, there is the reproduction of the same all the time, which I don't really agree with. But sometimes, I mean, I have not yet a clear idea on that because I think hierarchy, for instance, and patronage is very powerful to explain what relationships are, especially from the people. This idea of charisma and so on. This is an idiom of talking about power. So it's there, it's there. It's a way of explaining, of making reality simpler, so to speak, or justifying why this person has power and this person has not. So often justifying a posteriori afterward, right? What that means. Kings have been doing it. Aronpe has been doing it. You can see it in the work of Hillerman a lot, and so on, in the work of Nash and so on. So it's an idiom that's been used quite a lot. But I think it's something that it's a configuration of formation of power that exists in this kind of narrative. And I, for instance, right now, if I think about the military, if I use that kind of idiom, they're trying to reenact some kind of kingship, so to speak, and this kind of hierarchical working of society, changing pagodas and things, being violent, moving people as they want, subject and so on, as simple subject, and using, people as just means, basically. So in this case, the hierarchical argument is powerful, but then in how actually the reality is lived is it's a different story. So I was much more thinking through the ethnographic data about what are people actually doing and how it transforms politics and how it shows that there are important domains of politics that are there that are difficult to change. Also, family relationship, think through how it's conceptualized, their responsibilities and so on. Village affairs, I became a place of engagement before. the space where people do politics in the village. That's also something quite strong, takes some time. So, and the relationship with the state, for instance, is another one. So I was kind of, it's always a battle between the two. I think the dialectic is good to keep, but I really appreciate the work of the others. I've been pushing this way, that aspect or the other aspect. I try to be measured. I mean, I try to be balanced in relating with the work of my colleagues as well.
Okay, now you've brought up bone. I think this is interesting. Your ethnography is really interesting because I think it's sort of in some ways like a post-bone ethnography. You know, as you mentioned, all these other people that have focused on it so much, and you of course you engage with it, but you don't use it as a descriptive device in the same way that you said about power. But you've got this interesting fact in there that your interlocutors have said to you, which is relevant to this, I think, which you write that they say there are no more men of bone left in Gorji, which is a really interesting, anyone who's familiar with Myanmar studies and everything, when they hear that sentence, they'll be like, "Whoa, what does that mean?" So I want to just put those words over to you for you to explain that. What did these people mean when they said that to you?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I use that quote because of the power that it has inside it, right? What does it mean? I think it means that there was not people at the kind of standard that they used to have people. They are the real men of moral were gone, basically. And so it was a statement about the past was a bit better than the situation is now. So they often refer to the first monk of the village and one of the headmen in the past. So it was Uzanea and Udokai. Those two persons embodied the men of propriety, men of good morals, of who were able to guard and orient the village in difficult times. And it was also a statement about the present. And so what happened in between was the question that I asked myself. So if there is no more men of bone, or men that were worthy of being called men of bone today, what happened? And what happened in the meantime was the rise of the military state. Somehow, it's simplification, obviously, but I think it's kind of there is some truth in it, in that perspective, and also because the space and the opportunity to engage in politics were kind of reduced. This is quite a lot, especially after the socialist government disengaged from the villages, from the countryside, and you only have forced procurement, completely stupid agricultural policies, no updating of anything for public services in the village and so on. I'm not saying that the socialist period was great, but there was a complete disengagement from villages in the 80s, 90s. There was a lot of experience of violence, forced displacement, forced labor, dispossession, building of dams, of roads, of everything. And if you live nearby cities, you experience it quite often. This is also where the village headman came back in the picture, and the tension between Mimilong and Goji, because who was there to ask people to move or to provide labor or to ask fees and so on and so forth. So this kind of atmosphere of that's how the military state also appeared in local context. It's not just the people embodying with their clothes and so on. It's also what it make people do and how it shifted. So a way of looking at it, for making sense of it, I guess, for the people I've met was saying like the men of Rome are gone. But I'm very curious if they're back now. That's the question that I have in mind at this part of narrative. But it's difficult to get back around Muiwa, obviously. So it would take some time to answer that, but that's also very interesting because it's always changing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there may not be any more men of bone, or there may be, but there's definitely bone. Like, that's not going away. Yeah, fascinating. Well, that's a good future project for you. Now, because we're talking about bone and, the headman, the position headman, which is so important to your whole analysis, I guess we need to also just quickly touch on gender politics. People who read your book, or if you were teaching a class, they're like, "Oh, wow, okay, there's this thing called bone, and there's these headmen, and the men seem to just run the whole show." So, what do you say to people when they ask you, "Well, Stefan, why are the men doing all this? Like, where are the women with the power? Why is the headman always a man, and why are all of the men who elect the headman all men, and so on and so forth?
But that's why, thanks for the question. That's why it took me some time to also realize, obviously, that it was a book about masculinities and formation of manpower. So I don't know how to answer, like, why are men always in power? Because I might reproduce the kind of narrative that there is. A lot of it is the production of male leadership. So there is these qualities inscribing your body because of your karma, which is crystallizing the idea of Pung, for instance. But the whole production of family is also made by putting often the man as the responsible person for the household. And only in very few cases, at least in the places I've been, in case of powerful widows, have been running very strong, large compound, but will hardly make it to the position of village headman. I know that there's been some example, also some reference in the past, but I think there was quite a few. So the narrative, the justification of why it's men who should be in power is still very much strong there. At some point, I had to decide if I want to describe various power relationship, or if as a man, I was inscribed into this kind of production of man authority and what is expected to be a man into this in the various different situations from day to night, from what you should do and should not do, what you can participate, not participate, and so on and so forth. In the kitchen, not in the kitchen, in building house, in the farm field, in the monastery, in the different ceremonies, and so on. So there was a production of men basically over there, and I mean, we know those things. The thing is that, for instance, the novitiate hasn't been described as a production of men. Initiation rituals are very important. They've been described in other places, very much as how you produce men domination ideology, so to speak. But in the Burmese context, it's a lot about religion. How you make a prince before you can make a monk that is more than human, but only men can be doing this, and so on. So I guess for me, a solution to this kind of tension was to accept the fact that I was talking about and describing about the masculinities in the village.
Thanks. Well, I think that one of my favorite parts in the book, and this is a part that you've been, I remember we talked about a long time ago, was that you sort of explain all the different roles that the headman needs to take, how he calibrates his engagement with others and they do the same, with him. You tell it through a day in the life of a headman. So I wondered if you could run us through a couple of examples so that people can, understand in a very tangible way what you're talking about, what a headman actually does. You mentioned before that how they kind of represent the state. That's one of the things that they do, which can include asking people to do things they don't want to do. Right. So I wondered if you could just give us some examples there from your good friend and brother Gojo during your fieldwork.
Yes, I can do that. So describing a day in the life was something that was advised to me by a PhD supervisor, Ben Jones. And I found it very powerful device, and I pushed it through because I think it's a great way of describing a political institution, and especially in a place where you don't have really a public space, right? No office. I mean, there is a public office. There is an office in Mimilong, for instance, but it's not used, and it's built above an old cemetery, so nobody would be there. It's just there to be. There is an office. So what's public space, for instance? How people encounter this local village headman, which is a person from the village. And basically, the dilemma is to deal with that. Is to deal with being representative and being engaged in so many different kind of relationship that you need to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So basically, you wake up. I mean, I use that kind of device to show that. So a day in the life of the men is just a day in the life of like a lot of different men in those villages. You wake up, you take your breakfast. Basically, you might go to your farm field. I used in the book, obviously, particulars of days that are quite informative. Um, for instance, playing an online game with youngsters from the village might look very simple, but there's also a way of creating some kind of clientele or some kind of faction of young guys that you also teach through that way, but also that you support, that you help. So it was a good metaphor, for instance, of how you build a clientele and you play every day. And then in the morning, you're back on your phone. At that time, it was Game of Thrones, but it could be a different sort of games. Then you might move to the farm field and kind of arrange the labor with your uncle that is now your dependent, or maybe the uncle of your wife that you just married and is now some kind you're providing some work with this person, working on the land of your of the mother of your wife that might become part of your own patrimony. So you're so negotiating this kind of relationship. Then you might be called to build a house for one of the elders, and who is also your neighbor, and it happens to be the main village big man or old man, Huji. And so talking and building the thatch roof, for instance, turns into a consideration about what has to be done regarding the land formalization process that is going on, also the different land conflict. You might be called to a ceremony of engagement in a nearby village, which is not part of your village tract, but you might be called there as a witness, and you meet the villagemen from the other village tract. And at the end, it's a moment for you to spend time on finalizing a contract of a land sale for somebody else. You go back home, you take a rest, you might go and fetch your the leaves for congé, back to the broker in Noiwa, and you negotiate the price, and you also pay the workers. You invite everybody also for the having teas and so on, and refreshment, and you spend some good time also on the motorbike. Back home, and then you have the evening discussions. Obviously, we can touch upon sensitive topics such as how we relate with the monks, with the asking for donation, and this is not something you should be asking. How we're gonna deal with the asking advice about how to deal with the land conflict that involves previous headmen, also this kind of things. So through the day, family relationship, your own family and the one you belong to from your parents and extended family, through the wedding, through the temporality of building your family. This is something quite strong. Then you have this collective affairs as a village, and you go for different ceremonies as a witness or as a person that has to be there, and your involvement into that is quite important. If you don't care, people will see you don't take care of village affairs, and you don't align with the village big men, for instance. So how you align with that? How you show difference or not with the previous ones who's been embodying this institution? Are you asking money for formalizing a contract or not? These kind of things, very simple things, but you see, in the simple description that as I did, we can see how you build clientele and patronage relationship, but also the agency at play. So a day in the life is also a way of putting those things together.
And all of this eventually exhausted Gojo, and he didn't want to do it anymore.
Yes. He didn't want to do it anymore. Totally.
Which is fair enough, I think. Okay, I've got. We're getting close to an hour out now, so I want to start wrapping things up. You've made Gorgie famous with this book, whether you intended to or not. Now there's a book in the English language about a small village that many English language readers had never heard of before. So people feel like now they read your book, they learn a lot about Gorgie. They know a lot about Gorgie. Really interesting. But there has been this rupture in 2021. So I think it's natural for readers to want to ask you directly, what's happening in Gorgie now?
But half of the village has been burnt twice. They are escaping some early morning raids to nearby villages. Places they could trust have really shrink. Networks they could trust are also quite shrink. But in a sense, there is also a sense of continuity because they never really trusted the state, so to speak, military state, or the complicity around all those things. And they used to do by themselves, even though it was a propaganda from the state as well. But they used to do it and to keep the state at distance. Basically, the generation between 30 and 60, 70 is a bit different than the ones who were in the 20s. Basically, those who are married tend to stay in the village and keep working farms, trying to sell different products and so on in local markets. But it depends on the ability to go back to Muiwa or not. So curfew and so on, as you know, in different places. Youngsters have been moving quite a lot around the dry zone. I wouldn't say the places, but and for children, it's also quite tough living into this landscape. So yeah, Ugoji has changed quite a lot, but a lot of things remain as there have been some continuities for a very long time now. The orientation of the village, the flow of where the century things will not move. Perhaps the way they deal with collective death is moving. The way they deal with the displacement also, they welcome or not. Neighbor villages has been forcibly displaced because the village has been burned and so on. So this kind of situation, this kind of violence is, I guess, also changing the way they engage into politics and this very density and of local politics. What does it mean to engage in different kind of resistance is very important and tricky questions. So it's hard for me to answer that. I often have more questions than I have answers because I cannot go back and walking through digital ethnography is not something that I used to do with the people there. I mean, for me, they're not my informant or people I talk with. So I don't want to transform that relationship as well.
Do you know if is the headman position vacant? Do they have a headman now?
Yeah. No more.
So I imagine that there's still some pressure. I'm sure that the SAC would like there to be a headman, but there isn't.
Yeah, it's a state device. It's been created for that. It's been created to control and to collectively punish the bad villages.
Yeah, I guess I can ask you another question more generally about like how do you like reflect on what's happening there in an administration wise? Do you think that your ideas about calibrated engagement are useful for understanding the new kinds of politics that must be developing even more distant from the state? For example, like for so many people in Anyar now, the concept of a headman is so distant, of an SAC or a government appointed headman is so sort of distant, but there will still be, the history is important. There will still be connections and there will still be different kinds of authority and power. Have you thought about, taking calibrated engagement further in that sort of direction in a different political context post-coup?
Yeah, that's what I try to do, but it's tricky because you don't want to superimpose things on people's mind. So that there is headman or no headman, or that we should not have it, and so on. That's normal. I would say we should be wary of the reproduction of the same kind of structure that has been ongoing for a long time, not reproducing the JD and so on and so forth. So there will be some kind of different forms of leadership. We already saw that. I mean, the different armed force has been places for men to involve into politics in different ways. Sometimes from the network of CSOs and so on that has been creating before, farmer unions and things like that, but also from different angles. We see this diversity in the maelstrom of groups that most people have lots of difficulties to understand in this area. So of course, yeah, firstly, like how and the timing of engagement in the resistance, and what does it mean? Because resistance is one big word, and we obviously need to unpack it, especially in the face of exaction that's being done also by various forces claim to be anti-junta in Sagain at large. One thing that I want to highlight is the localism, the what we might see as fragmentation, the fact that there's been forces in many ways, and how can we try to explain it? And I think the isolation of villages in the 80s, 90s has a lot to do with that. And that there was not many space to engage in politics, and the political opening has created different space, but now that things have been closed down, there is a wide emergence of various leadership. We should be wary also of not defining too early as the new form of pont or charismatic leadership coming up. People like Bonaga could really fit, for instance, an example like that. So let's see the continuities, and especially the difficult thing is to be there and talk with people and see how they see what's happening.
Yeah, I guess the term we haven't used yet is the militarization of society, and that's basically what's really happening at mass, isn't it? What will that change, and what won't it change in the years ahead? Okay. Well, Stefan, a quick last one. Do you have any future plans concretely? What will you be doing next? Research, teaching?
Well, I'm mostly for research. I'm trying to look at the transformation of this form of engagement. I think it's a useful device. I'm going to push it as much as I can, because it can connect the ethnographic present and the history, and that's something I think is very important. I'm still focusing on the dry zone, and I'm very happy to collaborate with people interested into that area, because I've been doing my PhD alone, but I prefer doing much more collaborative work these days. So that's the plan for the future. Yeah. Keep working on the dry zone and see if Anya means one or many things.
Hey, that's terrific to hear. Okay. Well, wish you all the best with that, because as you've already intimated several times, it's not going to be easy. Yeah. Before we finish, I just want to give you the opportunity to give a recommendation, which is something I always do at the end of these episodes. If there's something that you've been finding valuable recently, or particularly interesting, or something that's coming up soon that you're looking forward to, anything like that, you're welcome to leave listeners with a recommendation before we sign off.
Okay, I'm thinking of an article by Deborah Tucker. It's something that another colleague, Dominic, gave me food for thought. It's an interesting article about those things when we think about the mandala, the hierarchy, and the agency. So it's an article by Deborah Tucker in the Journal of Asian Studies. I think it was 96. So it's quite old a bit. It's called Putting the Mandala in Its Place, a practice-based approach to the specialization of power on Southeast Asian periphery, the case of Akka. And this is an interesting read, because there have been lots of people trying to think differently. So these idioms about formations of power, the mandala, the hierarchy, and so on. So that would be my recommendation.
Sounds good. Yeah, and about the Akka as a case study, it sounds like.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. That's wonderful. All right. Well, yeah, it's been really, really cool having you back on the show after 8 years' time, and so happy for you that this has all gone well. Of course, it's very sad what's happening in Gorji and the rest of Myanmar and everything. But I think this was a productive conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to join the program.
Thanks a lot. No, I'm the one very happy to be here and share about this work I've been doing, and I hope people will enjoy it.
Yeah, open access, no excuses. Everybody,
open access.
Go and get it.
Thanks.